Welcome to Developing Continuity of Operations Procedures for School Districts. This webinar is designed to help you start creating continuity of operations, or Coop procedures, for your school's emergency operations plan. After this webinar, you should be able to explain the purpose and scope of a Coop, explain the basic elements that make up a Coop, and use the downloadable template to create a Coop for your school's emergency operations plan. Schools across the U.S. routinely plan for and practice what to do in the event of an emergency. Tornado and fire drills are a part of school life. Many schools participate in lockdown exercises with their local law enforcement and first responders. Administrators, faculty, and staff are often very familiar with how to respond in the immediate aftermath of an emergency. What happens, though, in the hours, days, and even months that follow an emergency? What if a tornado destroys the school? Or flooding has damaged roads that students need to take to get to school? Or a major pandemic requires schools to be shut down for an extended period of time? These, now more than ever, are questions that school personnel are asking themselves. Continuity of Operations Procedures, or COOP as it will be referred to throughout this webinar, are an essential part of a school's emergency operations plan that can offer answers to questions like these. The purpose of the COOP is to establish policy and guidance that ensures the essential functions of a school continue after an emergency. The goal of activating a COOP is to restore essential functions within 12 hours of activation and to sustain restored essential functions until fully operational status is achieved. In addition, the activation of a COOP serves to help protect essential buildings and facilities, equipment, records, students, teachers, staff, and assets, reduce or mitigate disruptions, and minimize damage to life and property. Continuity of operations, including the creation of COOP procedures, should be coordinated with local community partners, such as emergency management representatives and first responders, to maximize the use of existing infrastructure, facilities, and other resources. Developing the COOP should be a collaborative effort that includes not only school officials, but also local emergency management, law enforcement, first responder agencies, and others. An inclusive planning team will ensure the COOP is more comprehensive. When you start thinking about creating a COOP, ask yourself a question. What would we do if we couldn't use our school building to teach in tomorrow? Or, what would we do if a third of our staff became ill and were unable to work for an extended period of time? These are daunting questions, and the answers may seem overwhelming. But if you have a solid COOP in place, you should be able to confidently answer them. The scope of the COOP should cover all school-related essential functions, the personnel required to carry out those functions, and the buildings, equipment, and resources necessary for those functions to continue. Relatedly, your COOP should be broad enough in scope that it can be activated for all types of emergencies, threats, hazards, and incidents. In short, it's your guidance on how you'll operate when normal operations aren't possible. If your COOP addresses several basic elements, which are covered next, your school will be better positioned to recover after an emergency. A COOP addresses 9 elements to help ensure that essential functions of a school continue. Functions such as teaching and learning, protecting and maintaining facilities, business operations, and providing appropriate emotional and psychological support to students, teachers, and staff. The 9 elements of a COOP are: defining essential functions. Your planning team should identify all of the functions performed by the district or school and determine which are critical and need to continue after an emergency. Creating orders of succession. Orders of succession define who will play an active leadership role when regular leadership is unavailable. Creating delegations of authority. Delegations of authority define what can and cannot be done by an acting leader, that is, someone who was identified in the orders of succession. Identifying alternate facilities and locations. This section of your Coop is critical if you are unable to use your building and facilities that are necessary for performing critical functions. Establishing plans for communications continuity. Communicating with stakeholders like teachers, staff, students, parents and guardians, and others will need to continue, even if normal operations are disrupted. This section provides guidance on how you will continue to provide information to your stakeholders. Creating a plan for accessing vital records. Schools collect and maintain numerous records, from educational records, medical records, payroll records, student emergency contacts and personnel files, to emergency operations records like staff contact information, delegations of authority, and orders of succession. It's important that you have a plan for accessing these records after an emergency. Establishing a plan for human capital management. Teachers and staff should be clear about their role during and after an emergency, and students and parents should know how the school plans to continue educational activities. This is also where you can reassign personnel to more essential roles. Establishing plans for devolution. This section provides guidance for a worst-case scenario, one where a school has to transfer statutory authority and responsibility for essential functions to others because leadership is unable or unavailable for an extended amount of time. Establishing a plan for reconstitution. This section addresses the process by which administrators, teachers, staff, and students resume normal operations. This may mean returning back to the same school building or possibly a new permanent facility. These elements, each building off of and working in conjunction with each other, provide the substance of the Coop. And yes, it will require a lot of planning and working with your team to fill in these sections. But chances are you're already capturing some of this information in other areas, like safety and reunification plans. Others on your planning team will also be valuable in helping fill in the blanks for these elements. Emergency managers, for example, plan for communications contingencies if the power is out. Their input in planning for communications continuity would be helpful. Let's now turn to each element to discuss in more depth. This will help you understand what should be included in your Coop. You can also use the template provided to follow along as we go through each element. The first, and perhaps most important element of a Coop, is identifying the essential functions of your school. The rest of the plan is directly connected to those functions that are deemed essential. So, what makes a function essential as opposed to non-essential? You can think about it like this. What does your school need to continue doing no matter what the circumstances? What are the essential functions for each role within the school? Obviously, teachers perform essential roles, but so do maintenance workers, school psychologists and counselors, and administrators. It may be helpful to list the different roles in your school and the functions that each perform. Then identify those that are essential. From there, you can prioritize them and establish staffing and resource requirements. Next in your Coop, you'll want to address orders of succession and how authority will be delegated if the incumbents are unable or unavailable to fill their role. Your school may want to start by creating a list of key positions within the school and alternates who would serve in an interim or acting capacity should that be needed. Along with the list of alternates, each key position should know their decision-making authorities. These sections should be reviewed by the school's or district's general counsel to ensure it meets state and local laws and district policies. Schools may not be able to operate out of their normal location for a variety of reasons. A tornado could damage a building, making it unsafe for students and staff to return. Floods could cut off access to the school, or an infectious disease outbreak could force the school to close for an extended period of time. Whatever the reason, alternate facilities may need to be used until operations can return to normal. Think about the essential functions of your school, and then identify locations where those functions can take place. Are there other schools in the area that you can use? District offices, or other facilities? Can faculty, staff, or students perform any of these functions from home? The recent pandemic has tested the capabilities of performing essential functions like educating students in a home-based or remote learning environment. It's important to not only think about where these essential functions will take place, but also what is needed at the alternate facilities. Do the alternate facilities provide sufficient space, equipment, and communications capabilities? If not, can they be modified or have equipment brought in? Are they accessible to those who need to access them? If students and teachers are in a remote learning environment, do they have the tools they need? Schools should assess alternate facilities during the planning phase in order to understand where gaps exist. If, for example, education moves to a remote learning environment, do all students and teachers have the technology needed to participate? If not, what is the school or district's plan to address this gap? Or, if alternate buildings are used, do they allow for classroom separation? Have adequate internet access? Are ADA compliant and accessible? Do they have desks and chairs, or do you need to move equipment? Performing an assessment on alternate facilities ahead of time will save valuable time and resources when the Coop is activated. Being able to communicate with your stakeholders during and after an emergency is critical. Schools communicate with teachers and staff, students and parents, district and state officials, local officials, and the public. The methods of communication with each of these groups may vary, and it's important to consider how those communications will continue if the Coop is activated. If normal means of communication are disrupted, landlines, cellular towers, or internet access is down, other forms of communication may need to be considered. Your local emergency managers and first responder agencies could assist with providing alternate forms of communications, like access to county or state radio frequencies for communicating essential information until normal communications systems return. If you have to activate your Coop and are operating at one or more alternate facility, it's important to have a plan for accessing vital records and documents needed to complete essential functions. In order to complete this section of your Coop, you should make a list of vital records and documents and where they are stored. From this list, identify who needs to access them and how they will be available at the alternate facility. The planning phase is a good time to assess whether or not you need to create backups of your records and documents, and if the appropriate people have access to them if the orders of succession are implemented. If you've identified which functions of your school are essential, you may need to reassign faculty or staff to complete those functions. Employees performing non-essential functions prior to implementing the Coop may be available to be reassigned temporarily. It might be helpful to include a Coop organization chart in this section, outlining where personnel are assigned while the Coop is activated. Devolution occurs when all essential functions are handed over to alternate faculty, staff, and administrators, often at another location, because a school had to close and its personnel are no longer able or available to provide support in their daily roles. Although rare, schools should address this section by outlining the steps that would need to be taken to transition all essential functions to alternate personnel. It's important to identify what would trigger a process like this, describe how and when that process would occur, and identify resources required to complete this process. Eventually, all things will return to normal, or in some cases, a new normal. Your Coop should address how faculty, staff, and students will resume normal operations at the original or replacement facility. This section should include procedures on how personnel, students, and parents or guardians will be notified that they will be able to return to school. It's also very important to include the process by which the school will conduct an after-action review, or AAR. An AAR gives administrators a sense of what went well and what needs to be improved upon. Activating your Coop, even during a real-world situation, is an opportunity to test the plan and review how well the plan worked. This will help your school improve the plan over time. Schools hope they never encounter a situation where they need to activate their Coop. Unfortunately, threats, hazards, and incidents occur all too often. In 2020 alone, all schools across the state had to address continuity of operations in some form to continue to function during the coronavirus pandemic. Making sure your school or district has a Coop in place will alleviate a lot of stress for everyone. Addressing the basic elements of your Coop will ensure all essential functions can continue in the event of an emergency. There are other areas you may wish to address in your Coop as well. For example, you may want to include a section on the decision and alert process, the circumstances under which the Coop will be activated, and how personnel, students, and parents or guardians will be notified. You may also want to include a section that describes how you will maintain the Coop through testing, training, and exercises. You can also include important checklists and rosters, alternate location details, or maps and evacuation routes. Your Coop is just that, yours. It should be general enough to respond to all hazards, but specific enough to fit your school's needs. Thank you for viewing the Developing Continuity of Operations for School Districts webinar. Your Coop is a critical component in making sure your school or district is able to continue performing its essential functions during and after an emergency. A list of additional resources is also available for download, along with a Coop template. We hope this gives you the information you need to create or update your continuity of operations procedures.